Howdy, compelled unbeliever here. Today we're going to talk about the criteria of embarrassment, the argument of incredulity, their fallacies, and how the New Testament Gospels were written with Pauline bias. In this video, I'm going to reveal something to you that you've probably never seen or heard of before, how it appears that the New Testament Gospels minimalized the importance of the 12 disciples in order to legitimize the doctrine of Paul. It just got real.
Oh, wow.
The criteria of embarrassment proffers that the writers of the Gospels would not have included details that were difficult or embarrassing to the Christians, to the early Christian church. And thus it proffers that when there is embarrassing or difficult passages, that those passages are indeed authentic. The criteria of embarrassment is not used by biblical scholars by itself. It's used with many other tools in order to determine the authenticity of a given passage. Non-scholars or Christian laymen often take the criteria of embarrassment out of context without the accompanying tools used in textual criticism. A common example of this is in Mark 8:22 through 26. In this story, Jesus places his saliva in a blind man's eyes, lays his hands on them, and asks the blind man if he could see. The man responds that he could see, but the people look like trees. So Jesus laid his hands on him again, and finally he was indeed healed. This passage in particular is embarrassing to Christians because Jesus, who is God, actually failed to heal the blind man for the first time. Therefore, the criteria of embarrassment here proffers that Jesus did in fact heal the blind man, as early Christians would not want to include Jesus' failure to actually heal him. The argument from incredulity proffers that if something is so incredible or so difficult to imagine, that it must be wrong. Another way of putting this is, I can't possibly imagine that this could happen. Christians often make the case that the followers of Jesus would not have been martyred or risked death if they didn't truly believe or witness the miracles of Jesus. This argument fails in the fact that it doesn't take into account other religions that Christians don't believe in often make similar claims. Nor does it take into account that people often lie about embarrassing events in their lives just to establish trust with their audience. A good example of this is the Christian evangelist Mike Warnke, who claimed to be a satanic high priest in order to gain the confidence of Christians in his ministry. And his ministry was in fact very successful until his accounts were all proven to be fabricated. So as we go on into the next part, see for yourself where the criteria of embarrassment or the argument of incredulity might apply. Now let's take a look at the early church. There was much disparity between the early Jewish Christian church and the early Gentile Christian church, the followers of Paul. The early Gentile churches simply grew much faster as they were not familiar with the scriptures and thus more easily accepted the early Pauline doctrines. They also were a much larger demographic. Now, the Jews actually knew the scriptures. They actually memorized much of them. And they could not accept the new radical Pauline interpretations of the scriptures. These new Pauline interpretations of the scriptures dramatically changed the context and meaning of the scriptures. The beliefs and understanding of the early Jewish Christian church were in general fairly literal as far as we can tell from the earliest Jesus traditions, while the Pauline doctrine was actually very spiritual and didn't have anything to do with the physical world. It was this very disparity that shaped the writing of the Gospels. The Gospels are in no way history as we think of it, that being a factual account of concordant events. The Gospels were written at the very earliest, the first Gospel, Mark, 30 years after Paul started his ministry, and that was years after Jesus is said to have died. They were written by educated Greek-speaking followers of Pauline doctrine, not by anyone that knew Jesus at all. It is evident in the Gospels themselves that the writers of the Gospels were not familiar with the region, the customs, and were only academically familiar with the Hebrew language itself. The writers of the Gospels wrote historicalized accounts of the traditions of Jesus into a narrative that told the story about Jesus that they wanted to tell. This was a normative style of writing at the time that the Gospels were written. This is where it gets interesting. Throughout the Gospels, Jesus admonishes the disciples for never understanding his message. Not once does Jesus ever claim in the Gospels that his disciples understand his message at all. Even when they see great miracles over and over and over, each time they are made out to be completely astounded, as if they had never seen a miracle before and had no idea that it could happen. Then we get the doubting Thomas, the denying Peter, the betraying Judas, and James, the leader of the church, who is minimalized so much that he is barely mentioned at all. The other disciples' roles are evidently so unimportant to the authors of the Gospels that they are only mentioned in passing or as the narrative needed for the Gospels to be written. One must keep in mind that when the Gospels were written, the Jewish church was already losing influence. The Gentile church was gaining in numbers, and their theology was becoming more and more dominant as a result. It appears that the writers of the Gospels were trying to undermine the Jewish church and the authority of the disciples in order to qualify Pauline theology. Paul claimed to see Jesus through revelation after the disciples had seen him post-resurrection, and thus Paul claimed to have the correct doctrine, or the most recent, most viable doctrine that the disciples weren't actually privy to. And Paul was actually very successful. Today, Bible scholars estimate that 90% of the New Testament represents Pauline teachings, and the rest represents the traditions of Jesus. If this is indeed the case, then the embarrassing actions of the 12 disciples, their faithlessness, and the fact that Jesus never said that they got anything right, does not validate that the stories are true. Rather, it exposes the early politics of the church and gives us a better understanding of the origins of Christianity and the New Testament itself. I would like to know your thoughts on the criteria of embarrassment. Do the embarrassing accounts in the New Testament actually make the stories true? Could the followers of Pauline doctrine simply written it in that way to qualify Pauline doctrine? Could the case I've made here be so hard to believe that it's definitely wrong? I cannot say or claim to know that this hypothesis is true. But if we put Occam's razor to it, that being the simplest solution tends to be correct, it does appear then to be more reasonable than the criteria of embarrassment, or the fallacy of incredulity. This is Compelled Unbeliever. It's just a book.